Hi, everyone. Paul Krugman again. Um, I've got previous guest Jared Bernstein on with me for a talk about economic vibes. We had planned and hoped to have G. Elliott Morris in on the conversation, but he came down sick. So it's just going to be two economists who've spent a while on this stuff talking about what is still a quite interesting subject, which is why are people so negative about the economy? Which is, clearly very important for lots of purposes, but also just kind of interesting. So, hi, Jared.
Hey, Paul, great to be back with you on a topic that I know is compelling to both of us.
Yeah, I mean, maybe you should lead off by explaining why it's so compelling, and then
Yeah.
I'll chime in because we've both done work on this, but you've done more.
Yeah, well, to me, it's personal because I was in the White House in the Biden administration, Council of Economic Advisors, as you know, during this period when the vibecession, what began to be called the vibecession, I associate that with Kyla Scanlon, who I know you've spoken to, which was a situation where we were posting some good, strong macroeconomic numbers. GDP was strong. It was above trend. We got back to full employment very quickly after the pandemic-induced recession. But there was a big spike in inflation. As that spike came down, we were rolling down the other side of inflation mountain in the second half of 2022. We thought that was a pretty good development given how upset people were. But consumer sentiment, consumer confidence, people's feeling about the economy, these vibes just kept getting worse. And it seemed to me at the time that that shock to not just inflation, but to the level of prices, how much prices went up, was more important than most economists were realizing. As you well know, people in our field think a lot about inflation and inflationary shocks. We think less about the level of prices and sort of take that as a given. So that struck me as quite important at the time, and I began to look into it in ways I'm sure we'll get into.
Yeah, I mean, what was striking about it was that, I mean, historically, there's a pretty good relationship between consumer sentiment and macroeconomics. And way back, the misery index, which is the inflation rate plus the unemployment rate, was sort of pulled out of a hat, or by Arthur Oken,
Arthur Oken, yeah.
and did a pretty good job. And then you add a little bit more sophisticated, to version of that, and it has historically done a pretty good job of tracking, and did not after 2022. We had what, even by the measures that had worked before, looked like an economy that should have had people feeling a lot happier, and they weren't. And so, yeah, I mean, let's talk a little bit about price level, because I mean, what always struck me, even from the beginning, was, hey, inflation rate over what period? Why should it be the 1 year rate of inflation that enters into the misery index, as opposed to 2 year or 3 year or 4 year? But that's how we kind of started. I think number of people, you included, some of that's in your recent work, started by saying, well, maybe it's inflation over a longer period, but this kind of morphed into this price level issue. So why don't you tell me about how you did?
So a couple of things to amplify points you were just making. So my co-author on a recent paper, Daniel Posthumus, and I, we made a model of consumer sentiment, and this works both on the Michigan version and on the Conference Board version.
By the way, just for people should know that Michigan is the longest standing regular survey of how people feel. But the Conference Board, I don't know how far back they go, but the Conference
actually goes back to 62, intermittent, and the UMich goes back to 52. But that's kind of relevant for what I was about to say. So we built a model to predict these sentiment or confidence indices. We used the stock market returns, real consumer spending, inflation, unemployment. Very simple. And we ran it from 1990 to 2019.
Right.
It then predicts very well what the index does all the way back to the 1950s. So even though we ran it from 90 to 2019, it predicts the index, it tracks the index very well. And then, as you said, it breaks down in 2019. And look, 2019 was, as you well know, the 2021-22 inflation shock wasn't the first inflation shock in our history.
Yeah.
But it was the first one in this series where you see this big gap between where people should feel, how people should feel based on on those variables, those predictors, and how they do feel. And I do want to say, get this down early on, is that that's a pretty complicated thing to explain, how people feel about the economy. You know, you ask 10 people, 10 economists what vibes mean, or pollsters, whatever, they'll tell you 10 different things. But I think I think what happened to prices is very important. But I want to be clear, and you've underscored this in some of your recent work, it's not the only thing. There's that. I guess one other thing I'll say. So I have a particular set of experiences. I used to go out on WHNL, which stands for White House North Lawn, and that's where we used to go and talk to the cameras about how things were doing. And no matter where we started, no matter what we were talking about, a good unemployment report, we just had 250,000 payroll jobs, productivity's up, GDP, inflation's way down, groceries had a 12% inflation rate. Now they have a 1.5%. These are the things we were talking about out on WHNL to the T. It always got back to, why do people feel so bad about the economy? They're telling us things are too expensive. What are you going to do about that? So that really got into my head.
Okay, and so your story, and one that I have largely, gone with, but you did the hard work on the econometrics, on the statistical analysis, which I have not. But the is that again, people were not simply you or I would say, look, inflation is way down. They say, what do you mean? Things cost so much more than they did in 2019, and so you kind of introduced this kind of excess price level as a story, which is very widespread. But so why not that as opposed to just inflation over a longer period, or is there really a better story there?
Yeah, so they're quite similar. Inflation over a longer period is basically asking the question, how much did the level of prices go up over this period? So you raise a fair point. Most of what we talk about on inflation day is the change in the monthly inflation rate, or maybe the yearly rate. But I think in some senses we're circling around the same thing, which is people's memory about prices. And that's key to this research, and to it's something I hadn't thought enough about, but I've been kind of obsessed with, which is people's memory of what things used to cost. And this gets you down an interesting set of questions. So if that were the only thing in play here, everybody, including me and you, would be walking around totally depressed all the time, because when I started driving, gas cost 60 cents a gallon. And, right now it's $4 national average. But this increase from 60 cents to where it is now, or any other price you want to focus on that's salient to the consumer market basket, tends to go up very gradually. When you have a shock like we did in 21-22, people have this set of prices still emblazoned in their head. I used to call it the personal price vector, which is this idea that we walk around knowing what the things we cost, knowing what the things we buy kind of cost. And when that gets shocked, it is it's really quite upsetting to folks, and it takes a while for them to acclimate. The question is, what do we mean by a while? And I'm still wrestling with that question.
Yeah, there has to be a statute of limitations there somewhere, as you say. I mean, people aren't pining for the days of 15-cent McDonald's hamburgers, or you remember. I started driving a lot earlier than you did, so I don't remember what gas cost, but I do remember a quarter to go to the movies, and so yeah, there's obviously at some point people stop remembering. Actually, just on that, I mean, as part of, I'm probably going to get all nonlinear here, but I mean, the days before the big price shock we're now 5 years. I mean, I don't remember Now, admittedly, I'm probably more affluent. Well, I am more affluent than most of the population. I don't remember what ground beef or eggs cost in April 2021, but I'm not sure that many people really do. So how is it that we are still feeling this?
Yeah. So this is something I think about a lot. And I think the answer is that it's not just that we had that one shock, one and done and dusted. It's that we've actually had a series of shocks and that people haven't had time. A lot of this comes under the rubric of Trumpian chaos, or put differently, horrible crap that that the Trump
Yeah.
administration has thrown at the economy. Just really bad economic policy that have continued to perturbate this shock that consumers have been experiencing. So if it was one and done, I think people would be feeling better. But you get the Trump tariffs, okay?
All right.
That's a big shock to prices. Now, granted, we only import 11% of our GDP in goods, but walk down the aisles of Target and Walmart, you'll see a lot of those imports. So that's in play. And now we have the shock of the war. I think there are some other factors in play. Social media amplifies this stuff in a way that it hasn't in the past. And, actually, while I take your point about remembering what things cost, from talking to a few people, looking at some polling, actually people do still remember at least what eggs cost, which
Yeah.
was around $2 a dozen, and or 150 a dozen. And although it's not that far from that now, it's closer to 250 or 3, depending on what kind of sale you can get. It wasn't that long ago that it was 4 and 5 because of avian flu. So there's been a lot of other shocks to prices in the interim, and I think that's played an amplification role.
Let me just, while we're talking about it, the whole, people hate inflation. I mean, there's a, widespread view among economists, which is can, if you are not sufficiently cautious in laying it out, can sound condescending, which is, if you have, a big increase in prices, but also a big increase in wages, which is kind of what happened during the Biden years, that people should be saying, oh, I'm okay. My real income is kept up, but but they don't. They think that they earned the wages and that the prices was done to them. Are you okay with that view, or do you think there's something more going on here?
I think that view is correct, and that goes way back to research from many decades ago, and has recently been updated by Stephanie Stancheva that shows precisely that people, I think, kind of understandably, whether it's true or not, who knows, people understandably feel like if I get a raise, it's because of my hard work and I deserve it. If something happens to the price, that's not me. That's something somebody else did. And in a world of political, intense partisanship and vicious social media, that someone became Biden. I got my raise, but Biden did this to my price. And so I do think I do think that plays out in both political and economic spheres.
So more of if I have to say something that I think I was quite wrong about, was I thought that the bad vibes would kind of alleviate, diminish with the new president. Much as I thought that there was a strong element of partisanship in moving those numbers, and that has not happened. If anything, it's the reverse. And uh, I had a few hours before we had this conversation, I posted something about that. But what's your view on what?
So I have a strong view on this,
Okay,
and you captured it in your graphic this morning. I think that what's happening to Trump, this is not rocket science, by the way.
right.
If Elliot was here, he'd have more authoritative points on this, but I'm pretty sure I'm right. Um, I think there are three groups in the electorate. There is the never Trumpers, the always Trumpers, and then this really key group in the middle that's pretty dispositive. I mean, is dispositive in terms of determining election outcomes, which way they swing. Some people call them persuadables. What I think of them, at least in the context of our conversation, are people who believed Trump when he said, I'm going to lower prices on day one.
Right.
These are folks, according to my theory, which we've talked about so far, these are people walking around saying, damn it, I want I want my old prices back. I want my old interest rates back. I want my old mortgage rates back. And this guy not only is saying that he's going to give them to me, but actually the last time he was president, prices were lower and interest rates were lower. So let's put him back and, maybe we'll get back there. So they rolled the dice and they bet on the wrong pony. Whoops, I mixed a metaphor.
Yeah.
But you get what I'm saying. And
Now,
now they understand that they've bet on the wrong guy and that their prices aren't back to where they were. And in fact, inflation, if anything, has accelerated because of decisions Trump done. It's not just that he's ignored affordability or called it a hoax. It's that he's pushed hard in the wrong direction on these things. And this key middle group, which I think is behind some of the numbers you posted this morning, is very disenchanted by what they've seen.
yeah, Elliot has done this work. Again, it's hard to talk about this stuff without seeming condescending, but the people who um, swung to Trump in 24 and have swung hard against him now are disproportionately um, low information, which, that's not a pejorative, it's just a description. He defines it as people who don't know which party controls Congress. And they may well have, I guess the argument is that they may well have actually kind of believed Trump, or at least either believed Trump's promises, and probably I wasn't sufficiently clear on this, or just remembered that they were feeling pretty good in 2019. And
Yeah, so I mean, I also want to be very careful not to sort of criticize anybody for being, what looks like, to an economist like gullible, because like economists know that the only thing that really brings the price level down, meaning broad price
right.
deflation, is a deep recession, and nobody wants that. But people are getting jammed with all kinds of signals about how I'm going to make your life better for you. And it's I don't think the media has necessarily distinguished themselves in helping people sort this out. So it's, why not throw the dice and make a bet on someone who you think is going to do that kind of magic for you? The problem that a lot of people face, the group that we're talking about, is nobody ever seems to really help them enough. So that is a very important part of the agenda, what I call the affordability agenda, that I think we need to be working on and delivering on, sooner than later.
So, I mean, I would have said, and it's me being probably more partisan than you, despite the fact that you were actually in the administration. I would have said that Biden did a lot to help people. That there were a lot of aid programs that
Yeah.
considering. I remember how worried people were about long-term economic scarring from COVID, and instead we had this roaring recovery, and yet it didn't seem to penetrate. People didn't seem to give it any credit.
Well, the roaring recovery was real. I mean, you've been writing about this. I know we both admire Aaron Dubé's recent book, which is really a great documentation of the wage impacts back then. We wrote a chapter, much like what Aaron is saying, in one of our economic reports to the president, where we documented the benefits of such low unemployment to folks. So yeah, it's true that we definitely were delivering some things that improve living standards, but some of them, based on just the political hurly-burly of the time, didn't last long enough. So the child tax credit was hugely important and took child poverty down to historically low rates, cut it in half. And that was amazing. By the way, also underscores the point that whatever the child poverty rate is, or the poverty rate, that's a policy choice. And Biden chose to make it, a lot lower. I thought it was the right policy choice, but, it wasn't okay with Joe Manchin. And so it went back up when that program ended. And then when it comes to a lot of the investments, like, building our industrial policy, building new computer fabrication plants and investing in clean energy, that stuff takes a long time to pay off, and folks don't really see that. And then when it comes to affordability, people were concerned with housing prices, healthcare, childcare, the price of energy, which you highlighted this morning. And, those were areas where we tried but weren't able to do enough.
Uh, Consumer price index, the standard measures of price level, do not include interest rates. I mean, the way we measure housing prices is by either rents or an estimate of what your house would rent for if it were rented, and owner's equivalent rent. And when I look at different things, the one thing that really does stand out, one thing where really prices have effectively risen a lot more than wages, is in fact the mortgage payments. So how much do you think? I mean, there was a paper by Larry Summers. So all right, but that doesn't discredit the work, and saying that was a big part. What's your view on that?
I think that is true. I mean, I think the point of that paper and uh, my reference earlier to interest rates and mortgage rates uh, is that this is the price of money. So it's prices again. I want my old prices back. Well, what's the interest
Yeah.
rate? It's the price of borrowing. And so, yeah, I think that's in play. But I think where that rubber meets the road, I mean, it's definitely in housing costs.
Right.
So, housing costs really went up, very quickly over this period. And a very big part of this sentiment that we're talking about, this has been documented, is a lot of young people feeling like they'll never be able to afford to buy a house,
Yeah.
which is very pervasive. That sentiment and that truth is very pervasive. And how do many young people start building wealth? Through home equity, through buying a home. So that's a source of a lot of upsetness. But it's the rental side of the equation that was really driving folks, really giving folks a lot of problems back in the period when these negative vibes started to percolate and still do. If you look at the numbers, the share of income that people are paying on rent, it's 30, 40, 50% in some cases, and that makes it really hard to get by. So I think both the interest rate and housing costs are part of this puzzle, absolutely.
And it's one of those things because if you look at rents, I mean, rents really shot up, uh, 21, 22, and then they really sort of flatlined after that. And I'm not sure that at this point rents are any higher relative to. Maybe I'm wrong about that, but I thought rents were actually not looking like that big a problem now.
Yeah, now they've kind of, at least in terms of inflation, both this OER thing, the shelter or the housing component of the CPI is back to where it was pre-pandemic. So again, this is a level thing. So this gets back to something you said before. I would go out to talk to the TV cameras, and I'd say inflation was 10%, 9%, now it's 2%, and people would kind of hear, okay, so the prices I don't like, they're not falling, they're going up more slowly. And
Right.
you want me to stand up and applaud for that? And I think that dynamic has been in play in rental markets as well.
I think that was an old John Kenneth Galbraith line that he said when people say inflation has fallen, that they're saying that things are getting worse more slowly, which is sort of not really right, but at the other hand gets at this.
I think it is exactly what I would call it not really right, but gets just what you said. And I think the thing about it is, I I have this theory that I'm working on with some folks. So I don't want to lean too far into something that I haven't empirically really um, fleshed out yet. But I think there's something that goes on in this space when you have a shock to the price level. When instead of gradual movements in something people care about, you know, if something's getting bad, I guess it's the boiling frog story. If something's getting, kind of bad really slowly, you can learn to live with it, you can adapt. And if your income and wages are kind of going up at around the same rate, then you're not really the boiling frog. You're, pretty comfortable and you're getting along, or you're pretty uncomfortable. You made an important point this morning. A lot of people are just always, having some tough times. So you're either doing okay, you're doing badly, but at least it's not a shock. You're used to what you've been experiencing. And I think the interaction of a shock that's that sharp, that quick, and this is important too, when you've had 2 decades of really low inflation, and this gets into the 70s story, which we should probably get into a
That
little
one.
bit. Um, that's really a cluster mess for people's thinking.
Yeah. So yeah, you did your your estimates on starting in 1990. So it's really 3 decades. I mean, we had the basically Paul Volcker brought inflation way down in the 80s, and it was but we used to think that was low inflation when it was 4, but eventually got down to around 2 and stayed there for a long, long time. So only old codgers like me even remember a high inflation environment until what happened in 21, 22. It's kind of so yeah, the shock aspect I think was really
But
clear.
first of all, I sat in gas lines, so I a, a
Okay.
lot of our conversation, Paul, is two old boomers saying, "Well, I remember when things used to."
Yeah.
Uh, but um, but you asked a good question in some correspondence we had, which was, well, why didn't we have this kind of vibe shock when we had the late 70s, early 80s inflation shock? Because that was also a big shock. And, again, that was, when people like me were sitting in gas lines, which is a pretty uncomfortable and unfamiliar experience to most Americans. And I think one of the answers to that, you just didn't see the kind of vibes gap that we see in the
Right.
data now. And I think one of the reasons is because we hadn't had 20 years with inflation just very quiescent, inflation, below the Fed's target of 2% for many of those years, where we just didn't have to think about it. We actually had a cascading series of shocks back then. So I think the way we put it in the paper is that when people have been living with good weather for 20 years, a hurricane is way more upsetting to them than if they're sort of used to storms.
Yeah, and I mean it turns out that the increase in the price level under Reagan first term and under Biden were actually shockingly identical. I mean, within a fraction of a percentage point equal. And yet, Reagan runs on Morning in America, and Biden, everybody thinks I want the good old days of Trump back. And that's I mean, to some extent that might just be stormy weather. Also, it's just plain people came into Reagan expecting, with it, the Michigan median expected inflation over the next 5 years was, I guess, 7.4% or something when Reagan took office.
Right. When you start, um, sets off a path dependency that you kind of have to
Yeah.
live with. Um, but Paul, I actually wanted to ask you something about this, which is a little more forward looking. Um, this gets into some nerdy economic stuff that's less about the vibes and more about inflation and those dynamics. Federal Reserve a little bit, which is topical given that Kevin Warsh is in the news this week. Um, there is there is some thinking now. Governor Chris Waller, one of the Fed governors, gave a speech that I thought was quite articulate on this point. There is some thinking now that because we've had this series of shocks, of course, the pandemic, but then, the war in Ukraine, by the way, which was
Yeah.
another energy shock, and now the war in Iran, which is yet another energy shock, um, and the tariffs, which is another price shock. Because we've had all these kinds of repetitive upward pressure on prices, that the inflationary anchor, which I'll let you explain, is at risk of getting dislodged, and that is something that I do worry a bit about. Could you talk about that, but
Mhm.
also maybe clarify what the hell we're talking about?
Yeah, I've been all right. I mean, I think you probably have the same underlying model, although I think I may express it a little differently. But when we think about inflation, uh, there's a lot of I guess one way to say it is that inflation is a process of leapfrogging, that a firm sets its prices and then another firm sets its prices overlapping a bit and then the next one and so on. And what price you're going to set, because prices, you don't change your prices every day, at least in most things, uh, is it's partly catching up with price increases that have happened before, and it's partly getting ahead of price increases that will happen. So you're concerned about the prices that your suppliers will charge. You're concerned about the prices that your competitors charge, tells you how much you can get away with. Um, and so we usually put this as expected inflation, but it's actually both past inflation and expected future inflation that enter into determining what the current rate of inflation is. And the big story that we tend to have is that inflation, even if you have a bout of it, even if you have a spike in prices because of something like Russia invading Ukraine or the United States bombing Iran, that it's not as big a problem if it doesn't get built into people's expectations about future inflation. But we're always concerned that those will get uh, that expectations or will get unanchored, or that people will start to that we think that's what happened in the 70s, and that people started to build expectations of future inflation into their pricing, and that was uh, extremely costly to get rid of. The severity of the severity of the 79 to 82 slump was comparable to the global financial crisis, and it's uh, so yeah, and the question obviously is, uh, are we are we doing badly enough for that to happen? And actually, I'd say there's two forward-looking questions. So that's one, and so Chris Waller. I mean, we're all kind of, we had a great experience, right? That's actually part of what I want to get at. In terms of the things that macroeconomists were worried about, the 21-22 inflation spike turned out to be kind of everything worked out fine. Expectations didn't get unanchored. The inflation was transitory, although transitory turned out to be longer than we thought.
Transitory.
Yeah, slow,
Long.
but in the end, they meant that the definition really should be functional down a time period, and it didn't, in the sense that we did not need to go through an extended 1980s style slump to bring inflation down. That was that was the what we had all hoped for. Um, but can we count on that happening again? And that's, yeah. I mean, how much do you worry? I mean, Waller is clearly is starting to, and Waller, by the way, was a big dove. He was one of the people who basically kind of went
Right.
after the people who were predicting many years of high unemployment, saying, no, you're wrong.
Yeah, so people who are interested in what we're talking about should go read the speech that Waller gave earlier this week, I think, or late last week. Anyway, it's in my Substack. You can find a link to it.
Yeah.
It's very clear and really, I thought, incisive on these issues. Um, so I'm worried, Paul, and I'm a historical dove. And when it comes to full employment and inflation, balancing the Fed's mandate, I've long worried about the full employment side of the coin. And now I'm worried a little bit more about the inflationary pressure side of the coin. Now, that may be because of my own PTSD from when I was, going through this in the administration. But, but the Fed has been above its target for 5 years. That's a long time. And it seems inflation seems kind of stuck around where it is. Now, look, if the target were 3% instead of 2%, the world would be fine. Obviously, wages would have to and incomes would have to catch up to that, but I think that would happen on average, which is a big statement.
Yeah.
But when, if the Fed can't get back to its target in a climate with a reckless and unchecked person in the White House who is instincts are highly inflationary, as is all authoritarians,
Yeah.
regardless of what country they preside over. Yeah, I'm worried about it. I'm worried about the anchor.
That's a funny, actually, I have turned a little more hawkish than I used to be. I used to be very critical of the 2% inflation target, which in many ways I thought was too low. And if we ask, the history of how we ended up with 2% is kind of weird and also kind of funny. I mean, it's one of the few major things that you can really blame on New Zealand. But anyway, that's because they were the first to do it. But it was there were a lot of arguments, particularly during the long slump after the global financial crisis, for saying that 2% was too low. But now you kind of said, well, 2% is low enough that people just stop thinking about inflation. And 3% is starting to, I used to say 4% made sense, and now I'm not sure that would be okay because it might, and that credibility, the ability to get over the inflation shock, the supply chain and Ukraine shock, I think had a lot to do with the fact that people really did not expect higher inflation on a sustained basis. I'm worried now that in losing 2%, particularly in losing 2% unintentionally,
Yeah.
might be a serious problem.
Yeah, I share that concern. But let me ask you a question, and I should speak to this too, but I want you to go first, which is, so we've talked a lot about what we think are driving these negative vibes. What do you think we should be doing about it? What is the right path? What is the best path forward to get vibes to realign vibes with where they were pre-pandemic at least?
That's a really good question, and I mean, part of the answer is, what do you mean, we white man? Who is we? What should we be doing? Well, obviously not you, or certainly not me, and at this point, not you, unfortunately, either.
No,
So
no,
we're
that's not correct. I'm very ensconced in policy efforts, which I'll talk about in a minute, but you go ahead.
okay. All right, but it is the Federal Reserve, but also, yeah, uh, you know, there's a very good chance, I guess, that Congress will be in different hands in a few months, and that the White House will be in different hands in 2029. But it's a really, I mean, don't do stupid stuff would be a good start.
That'd be a great step forward.
Don't launch unnecessary wars. Don't politicize the Fed. But I do
Tara.
worry. I mean, I worry that one of the things, what a lot of people have taken, we've just had this ongoing, we're in the middle of an ongoing discussion in which you and Elliot have been making the point that it's kind of price level. And then there's a lot of people saying this means that, does this mean that the vibes are going to be negative for the foreseeable future? Are we in, among other things, for a political universe in which every president of whatever party has a disgruntled public because prices are too high, and so it's always throw the bums out every 4 years,
Yeah.
and that's and I don't know that what I think this is one of the things that actually hinges a lot on what we think really is driving the vibes, and on the is when's the statute of limitations on the price level that people expect. But it is a real concern.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the goal here, it's funny. I mean, I myself frame this as like, the goal is getting vibes back to some level that they used to ride at. Really, the goal is much more a political economy goal, at least in my head,
Right.
which is to help people be able to make ends meet in an economy that's been growing at a good clip for a long time. I mean, we're actually quite productive. We have good GDP growth. Even the unemployment rate is pretty low, even if job creation has been just about zero. So a lot of people justly feel, and I mean, this is not a low information sentiment. A lot of people justly feel like they're just not getting their fair slice of the pie that they're helping to bake. And so we have to reconnect their living standards to the growth in the overall economy. You said something decades ago that has always stuck with me, which is, for way too many people, economic growth is a spectator sport, not a participatory
Yeah.
sport. So what's the linkage there? To me, it's the affordability agenda. And this is what I'm working on at the Center for American Progress and at the Stanford Institute for Economic Policy Research, which is crafting an agenda, a policy agenda, and getting politicians interested in it, which is another part of the that will help correct market failures and flaws in key areas of the household budget. Healthcare policy is something you're very familiar with.
Yeah.
Childcare. We have great plans in that space. Housing, we've already put out a plan that's gotten, I think, widely viewed, quite positively viewed in that area. We have a great plan coming out on electricity prices. We tried to do a thing on groceries. That's a lot harder because it really is pretty much a market good. But that's the agenda. And I don't think that people necessarily have to understand all the fine points in the policies, but you got to deliver. And, that's a really heavy political lift. But I think that's the connection that needs to be made.
Yeah, I mean, I would say also that you have to be seen trying to deliver. That's really
Yeah,
kind of important.
good point. Got to get
Uh,
folk trying.
well, I mean, although there was always a question, what were you and your colleagues bad salesmen? Um, and I've been,
Yes.
could you have done something different? Is the question, I guess, is and so I'm sitting right now in the heart of the uh, communist, anarchist, Islamic revolution, whatever, with the Mamdani administration in New York, which has very limited ability to affect these issues, right? Although the one place that they do have more, that he has more impact probably is housing affordability, because that is a lot of local policy. But at least 100 days in, he's been spectacularly successful at visibly trying to do
Well, I
something
think
about it.
Mamdani is exhibit A of what I'm talking about.
Yeah,
He ran on affordability.
yeah,
You can call it sidewalk socialism, but he's filling potholes as well as delivering childcare and working on housing.
yeah,
He is I think a model for exactly what I'm talking about. And look, yes, his powers are limited given where he sits, but however many months in, it's working. Now that's way too soon to make any kind of a
right,
judgment. But I think, and by the way, yes, Mamdani is the most visible example of the model I just described in action, working as well, better than I could have hoped, at least thus far. But here in Virginia, we have a centrist named Abigail Spanberger, Mikey
right.
Sherrill in New Jersey, both centrist Democrats running on similar policies. So this is not just a socialist thing.
I know. It's just New York, and New York is sui generis on
Yeah,
every level, including
sure.
but
Including pizza and bagels, but that's a different discussion.
yeah. Well, it's even more uh, I think it's a lot easier to find Eritrean food, which I had with friends the other day here, than it is in most places in America. But anyway, let me sort of finish. One of the things that worries me about this whole vibes episode is, aside from the political economy and all of that, is um, what do we do in the next economic crisis? Because
Mm.
what strikes me is that, if when the supply chain issues became clear, when it became obvious that the recovery was, that some things had been disrupted, and that demand was really very different mix from before, and that you started to see those uh, container ships steaming back and forth, waiting for a berth, and all of that. That um, there was going to be a large inflationary shock coming from that, and that the right policy, assuming that you could keep expectations anchored, was in fact to accommodate it, to have a burst of inflation and then stabilize after that. That a one-time rise in the price level was actually exactly what the optimal policy model said you should allow to happen, and it did happen, and people hated it. And now I'm worried that we will do something stupid next time. Is that your concern as well, or?
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, first of all, the concern about will we do something
No,
stupid
right.
is bearing out in real time. But you're talking about specifically, I guess the way I would frame your question is, has Keynesian stimulus in a recession been discredited by what just happened?
Yeah,
And I very much, obviously hope that's not the case. The supply shock, what you described as the supply chain snarl up part of the pandemic, was very sui generis, of course, and was a function of a 100-year virus. So that's a lesson we don't want to overlearn. Adding to my worries about this is the reality that our fiscal outlook is actually as bad as it's ever been,
yeah,
at least in my lifetime. So arguments, even though the kind of fiscal interventions we're talking about, the Keynesian kinds of interventions we're talking about, you'll actually be fiscally worse off if you don't do them than if you do them,
yeah,
because you'll end up with worse GDP outcomes. But there will be those who will point to the debt and say, we can't do anything. Look at the magnitude of the debt. So yes, I'm very worried about that. And my only solace is that one definition of a Keynesian is a Republican in a recession. They all get they all get very stimulative oriented pretty quickly in that situation. So maybe just the power of a rising unemployment rate and its populist impact will drive more better policy in that regard. But it's a concern.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I would have said that. Yeah, post COVID and Ukraine was a unique event, except now there's Hormuz, and you start Googling choke points, and it's not hard to think that maybe it's not that unique an event right now. And
I agree with you, and so I do think that one of the things I'm trying to do, and I think you're trying to do this in some of your work, is to just remind people what good economic policy looks like. It wasn't that long ago, as you've said in numerous posts and in this conversation, we applied a lot of economic thinking in the Biden years, and if you if you take away everything we've been talking about for the last hour, which is the negative vibes around the inflation and the price level, I think you'd have a good example of really pretty effective policy making that helped not only increase the economy's growth and its capacity, but delivered those bigger slices to folks who are helping to bake the pie and in who many ways need them most, the most economically vulnerable people, whether it was the advantages to the poverty rate, whether it was lowering the uninsured rate, or whether it was simply helping to maintain a strong enough labor market that wage gains reach the bottom of the scale. So I guess my point is we know how to do this, or at least we have an
right,
idea. We just have to really fight hard for the politics to get back there. I guess one last point I'll make on this, and we've talked about this as well, resistance is not futile, and people want something different than what they're getting. That
right.
seems very clear.
Yeah, and I wonder a little bit. I mean, a year ago, probably would have said, look, the Biden team, you included, by and large, did good stuff, responded very well to the COVID crisis, and got totally savage politically for their success, and that made it very hard to imagine, that meant that we might be taking all the wrong lessons. I have to say that one small silver lining to all of the crazy stuff now happening is that it does seem to be gradually making people think better of the previous experience and kind of understand a little bit. I'm not sure. I think the public is actually probably ahead of the political universe. But I don't know. Do you feel that people are more appreciative of what you all did now than they were before?
Well, I mean, it's a good question. I run in probably, circles that are maybe somewhat similar or adjacent to ones you do. And what I get a lot of from at least the people I talk to is you guys did a great job, but your messaging was terrible. And, we sort of referenced that a few minutes ago.
Yeah,
I will agree that, our messaging was far from optimal and that a lot of times we were talking past people. I think there's a difference between talking past people and lying to people. And
right.
we were honest. But I don't think there was some magic set of words we could have said that would have made things all that much different. And I think you made a similar comment a
Yeah,
while ago. So I do think that sentiment, you did a good job, but you didn't convey it, is live. I don't know how, I don't know that people are feeling. I think if you go out and poll people, again, Elliot would know. I think if you go out and poll people, at this point, they might be saying Biden was better than Trump because Trump has turned out to be such a mess. But that they didn't think Biden, they wouldn't agree with probably where you and I are, at
right.
least on the economics. At some level, vibes are a function of people's faith in the government to actually have their back, to get behind them and lastingly help them. And it's been a long time in the Trump years. I mean, okay, it's actually been a little over a year, but it feels like decades
Right.
since that's been the case. Joe Biden and his administration, which I was proud to be a part of, certainly worked hard to do that. And we can have good debates about how far we got. But we were trying. And at this point, we have a government that's not trying at all. And in fact, when it's not self-dealing, it's pushing in the other direction. So I don't think it's that heavy a lift to get back to a point where we're trying to rebuild people's faith in a government that actually does useful things for them. And that, to me, is a North Star.
Good place to end. Thanks a lot.
My pleasure, Paul. Great to talk to you.